Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 285, Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane is almost here. It's only a couple weeks away on March 4th, and this video is going to be the top 3 reasons I hate UFC 285. I'm going to go from 3 to 1, 1 being the reason I most hate UFC 285. And let me just tell you this. Some of you guys who watch the channel may already know the number 1 reason, but this is probably the number 1 reason I've hated a card ever. That's how infuriated I am about the number 1 reason on my list why I hate UFC 285. But I'm going to start with number 3. I'm going to go to number 1. I have a couple honorable mentions as well because as good as this card is, there is a lot to hate about this card. But don't get me wrong. I understand this is still a very good card with a lot of good fights. I'll also be doing a video called The Top 3 Reasons I Love UFC 285. I will link that down in the description as soon as that is uploaded on the channel. But I'll be doing a bunch of UFC 285 content, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now, before I get into any of my honorable mentions, do me a favor, go look over the UFC 285 card and comment down below what reasons do you hate UFC 285. I'm curious to hear any of the reasons you may hate it before you even hear my actual reasons for hating the card. So starting off with the first honorable mention, that is that we are not getting Valentina Shevchenko versus Taila Santos 2. Now, this isn't the biggest gripe in the world, but Taila Santos had a very close fight with Valentina Shevchenko back at UFC 275. And afterwards, a lot of people believe that Taila Santos won. And even if you don't think she won, it was a very close competitive fight. And a lot of people wanted to see that rematch ran back. And instead, we're getting Valentina Shevchenko versus Alexa Grasso, which, you know, I don't really have a lot of anticipation for. I know Alexa Grasso is on a win streak right now, but I don't see her being able to dethrone Valentina Shevchenko. So I think this fight, at least the perception for me, is that Valentina Shevchenko versus Grasso is far less competitive than a Valentina Shevchenko versus Taila Santos rematch that most of us wanted to see. You know, we kind of wanted to see that fight ran back after how close the first fight was. So it's just a little disappointing that instead of putting Taila Santos back in there, I understand it wouldn't have inevitably happened anyway because Santos just got injured and pulled out of her fight with Erin Blanchfield. But nonetheless, that is the fight I would have preferred. And instead, we're getting Valentina Shevchenko versus Alexa Grasso, which I'm not particularly pumped about. The next honorable mention I have 2 honorable mentions for UFC 285. The next honorable mention I have is that UFC 285 could be the end of Cody Garbrandt's career. He's been brutally KO'd in 4 of his last 5 losses. And, you know, he's only won 1 out of his last 6 fights. And that 1 win was against Rafael Sunsao back in, 2020. He got brutally finished by Kai Kara-France as he moved down to flyweight. He lost to Rob Font, got beat up by Rob Font. Has the win over Rafael Sunsao, got brutally finished by Pedro Munoz, and got brutally finished by TJ Dillashaw twice in a row. And for the longest time, and I don't think it was ever scheduled for UFC 285, but the UFC tried to put together Cody Garbrandt versus Ronnie Yaya. And that was the perfect fight because Ronnie Yaya has never finished anyone in his entire MMA career, or as far as TKO or KO is what I mean. He's primarily a grappler. He wants to take you down and submit you. It was the perfect matchup to get Cody Garbrandt back on track. And, this was one of those fights that was just so perfect for Cody Garbrandt. And then it got changed to Cody Garbrandt versus Julio Arce, which is still a decent matchup for him. And now it's Cody Garbrandt versus Trevin Jones. And I know Trevin Jones doesn't have the best KO power, but he has 3 knockout wins out of 13 total wins. He's on a 3-fight losing streak, but he still has decent striking. And Cody Garbrandt, as good as he is in terms of his skill set, he has a massive off button on his chin. And I'm just really nervous because there's this give and take when you give a guy a favorable matchup who's already on a downslide in their career. Because Cody Garbrandt now, you can kind of, excuse away the last few losses. Kai Kara-France, one of the best at flyweight. The Rob Font, top 10 ranked at bantamweight. Pedro Munoz, at the time, top ranked at bantamweight. TJ Dillashaw, those were for the bantamweight title at the time. You can kind of excuse away those losses. But when you get a favorable matchup like Trevin Jones, who's on a 3-fight losing skid, who doesn't have very many KOs, if he comes out there and clips Cody Garbrandt on the chin and puts him to sleep, that is the end of Cody Garbrandt's career, at least his UFC career, in my opinion. So I hope Cody Garbrandt gets back on track with this fight. His opponent's been switched around so many times, and I just feel like that Ronnie Yahya fight was so perfect, and now it's not happening. Something is just telling me Cody Garbrandt, the end of his career, is going to happen at UFC 285, and he's still so young, and he's still so skilled, which makes me super depressed. But it may not happen, and that's why it ended up being an honorable mention on my list. Moving on to the number 3 reason I hate UFC 285 is Jalen Turner versus Mateusz Gamrot. And I know that sounds crazy. I absolutely love that matchup. This is the fight I wanted to see. I hate that we have such a highly skilled matchup between 2 top 10 ranked lightweights. I hate that it's on a couple weeks' notice. Jalen Turner was originally supposed to fight Dan Hooker. Dan Hooker pulled out, saved himself a savage beatdown by Jalen Turner. And Mateusz Gamrot decides to step in. And shout out to Gamrot for taking this fight. This is a tough fight against a surging contender in Jalen Turner, who's currently on a 5-fight win streak, who's looked incredible in his last couple fights. And Mateusz Gamrot, he's coming off that loss to Beneil Dariush. No shame in that. Beneil Dariush is arguably the number 1 contender right now. He should be fighting for the belt next. But when you have such a massive lightweight fight between 2 top-ranked contenders that is very meaningful in the division, don't get me wrong, I'm happy this is on UFC 285, but I hate the fact that it's on 2 weeks' notice, essentially, and you're always going to have that asterisk next to it. Because even if Jalen Turner loses, he was training to fight on UFC 285 anyway. To go from Dan Hooker to Mateusz Gamrot is a massive stylistically different matchup for him. And I just don't think, this fight of this caliber should be happening on short notice. And I hate to see either Jalen Turner or Mateusz Gamrot lose. And then they always have that built-in excuse where, well, I took it on 2 weeks' notice. And even if Jalen Turner wins and he looks super impressive, people are going to say, well, Gamrot stepped in on short notice, so what does it really mean? It's kind of one of those situations where it's an amazing matchup. I'm really looking forward to it. But I hate that it is on short notice. I feel like maybe they should have rescheduled it for maybe another month down the line. Make it a main event of a UFC Fight Night card. Put it in the Apex for all I care. I'm tired of these terrible main events in the Apex. If you're going to continue to use the Apex, might as well put some great contender matchups like Arman Tsarukyan and Mateusz Gamrot from last year. This would have been a similar scenario for Jalen Turner versus Mateusz Gamrot. So I just hate that that's on short notice. Moving up on my list to the number 2 reason I hate UFC 285, and that is that Bo Nickal is on the main card. He is opening up the main card versus Jamie Pickett. And, Bo Nickal, I know there's a lot of hype behind him. He is 3-0 in MMA, and he's fought nothing but grocery store cashiers up until this point. And I was hoping with all the talk saying, I would take out Hamzat and I would take this guy and that guy out. And Bo Nickal, he has an impressive wrestling background. I wanted to see him test it. And instead we're feeding him Jamie Pickett, who's lost 4 out of his last 6. It's not really much of a test. I mean, Bo Nickal's going to win this fight. He's going to look impressive. He's going to out-wrestle Jamie Pickett with ease. And then people are just going to blow up the hype even more. I understand the UFC's trying to build him, but we couldn't have got a little bit better step up. The way Bo Nickal's talking, he wants to take out Hamzat Chimaev. So why are we feeding him Jamie Pickett, who is 13-8? 13-8. He's got a less than a 500 record. And Bo Nickal's got all this hype around him. I understand that he's only 3-0. I understand that he's coming off Dana White's Contender Series. But he's 27 years old. He is talking a big game. Hamzat Chimaev did it, and look what the UFC did. Couple fights in, Hamzat Chimaev fights Li Jingliang, and then fights Gilbert Burns. And I know Bo Nickal, this is his UFC debut, but I feel like the UFC could have came up with a little bit higher ranked opponent within the middleweight division than Jamie Pickett. And also, on top of that, even if you want to keep this fight together, it shouldn't be on the main card. You have Derek Brunson versus Dricus du Plessis on the prelims. That should easily be on the main card above Bo Nickal versus Jamie Pickett. So the order of this card, and I know Bo Nickal said, "Oh, I'm fighting on a pay-per-view first. I'm not going to fight on the prelims. I'm a big star. He's already making a name for himself." But there is no way that a matchup between Bo Nickal and Jamie Pickett should be higher up on a card than Derek Brunson versus Dricus du Plessis. And I understand, Derek Brunson's kind of on a downslope and hasn't looked particularly great recently. And Dricus du Plessis is on a win streak, but probably looks the worst of any top-ranked middleweight, even in his wins. But at the same time, that is a fight that means something within the middleweight division. And it's not really a throwaway matchup like Bo Nickal versus Jamie Pickett, where Jamie Pickett's basically just being sacrificed by Dana White to Bo Nickal to kind of raise his hype up and raise his stock up. So I really kind of hate that that's on the pay-per-view portion of the main card. It kind of just sours the card a little bit, in my opinion, especially when you have better fights on the prelim. But it is what it is. What are we going to do about it? I'm still looking forward to seeing Bo Nickal fight. I just wish it was against a tougher test, and I wish it was like the main event of the prelims. I think that would have made the most sense. Moving on to my number one reason I hate UFC 285. And this one actually every time I think about it, it actually gets me infuriated. And, I love the main event of this fight card, Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane. But the number one reason I hate this card is because we should have got Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou for the UFC heavyweight title. And instead, we're getting Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane. I am happy to see Jon Jones return to the UFC. I am happy to see Jon Jones fighting at heavyweight. I'm happy to see Jon Jones fighting for the heavyweight title. I think this fight is very compelling. And I'm going to talk about it in various other videos that I'm going to do in the lead up to UFC 285. But you can't tell me that you're not depressed that we're not getting Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou. Picture this. Jon Jones, the consensus greatest of all time, and the consensus greatest of all time light heavyweight as well. Picture him standing across the cage from Francis Ngannou, who has unbelievable knockout power, nuclear power in his hands. Of his 17 wins, 12 by knockout. Of his 17 wins, 16 by stoppage. And you have Jon Jones, who I know people question the Dominic Reyes fight. They say the decision. Nonetheless, Jon Jones is virtually undefeated. The Matt Hamill loss does not count. And even if you consider the loss to Dominic Reyes because of the bad decision, Dominic Reyes didn't put Jon Jones out cold. Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou, you basically had a 50-50 shot that Francis Ngannou goes out there and brutally KOs Jon Jones. And I know a lot of people hate Jon Jones. Jon Jones has done a lot of terrible things. And there's a lot of people clamoring to see that. I don't think Ciryl Gane, even if he does win, which I still think there is a very high probability that Ciryl Gane can win, he's not putting Jon Jones out cold, I don't think. And Francis Ngannou, the matchup was so much more compelling to have a freak athlete like Francis Ngannou, who had unbelievable nuclear power, standing across from the consensus GOAT, who hadn't fought in 3 years. The storyline would have been incredible. I just literally can't even imagine how hard my heart would be pumping watching those two stare down in the center of the cage as the ref says, "Do you have any other questions?" That matchup was a once-in-a-lifetime matchup for the UFC. And as a fan of the UFC for many years, every time there's a fight that I feel like the fans are really clamoring for, I feel like the UFC always misses the mark. There's some fans that has never even seen Jon Jones fight. So a lot of people aren't going to remember this. People were dying to see Anderson Silva versus GSP. That's a fight that never happened. People were dying to see that. People were dying to see Anderson Silva versus Jon Jones at one point in time. It never happened. And I feel like you can throw Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones into that very same category. We have been fiending for this fight for probably 2 years. You have a freak of nature in Francis Ngannou who knocks everyone out cold, or almost everyone but Ciryl Gane. And then you have Jon Jones, who's been so dominant for so long. I know people are going to say, oh, the decisions against Thiago Santos and Dominic Reyes. But nonetheless, Jon Jones has looked incredible throughout his UFC career. He's been teased going up to heavyweight for so long. To have the prospect of him going out there against a freak of nature like Francis Ngannou, potentially getting KO'd, or imagine this. Imagine Jon Jones went out there and dominated Francis Ngannou somehow. Ducked under his big power shots, took him down, beat him up, and won the heavyweight title. What a moment in history that would have been. And instead, I feel like it's watered down a little bit. Ciryl Gane, I know he beat Tai Tuivasa, but before that, he lost to Francis Ngannou not that long ago. A little over a year ago, Ciryl Gane's getting taken down and controlled by Francis Ngannou. So it waters down the main event a little bit, when instead, I believe the UFC could have put on one of the biggest UFC pay-per-views of all time with Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou, and it would have just been just another notch higher. Don't get me wrong, I'm excited for Jones versus Gane, but Jones versus Ngannou would have been so much better, and I would have been so much more excited, and I think the pay-per-view sales would have done better as well. I think that would have been, one of these fights that comes around every 5 to 10 years, where the UFC really would have sold a significant amount of pay-per-views. No doubt it would have done over 1 million buys. So I think the UFC missed the mark with that. I think they should have figured out a way to get a deal done with Francis Ngannou and make the fight happen. Ultimately, they didn't, and that's why I hate UFC 285. So let me know, guys, what you think of my reasonings down in the comment. Is there any reasons that I missed why you hate UFC 285? I'm genuinely curious to know. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.